All right. This is uh, lecture 2.1. So this is chapter 2 in the American Yacht, right? Sections 1 through 4. All right. And we're going to kind of, in lecture 1, we looked at Native American societies prior to European conflict, right? Now we're going to look at Europe and especially Iberia, Spain, and Portugal on the verge of contact, right? What had changed in those societies, in those countries, that lead it to push out and eventually explore and discover the Americas and begin the process of colonization in Spain, right? So we're not going to get to Columbus in this section, but we are going to talk about some of the things that are going to play factors in that expansion. Okay. Central question: what combination of motives, technology, and existing global connections allowed small Iberian kingdoms to build the first Atlantic empires, right? How does Portugal, how does Spain come out of the 1400s ready for colonization, right? Prepared to take advantage of all of these changes in the world, right? How did their maritime technology change? How did the economic, religious, and political factors that play into the desire for colonization, the push out of the Iberian Peninsula, right? And then also, we'll talk about how the role Africa plays in this trade, right? And the connections with Africa and African kingdoms and African governments that lead into this, as well as this what we might call the dress rehearsal for colonization, right? In the Azores, Madeira, the Canary Islands, Sao Tome, these small islands off the coast of Africa in the Atlantic, where Portugal and Spain set up plantations, grew sugar, and kind of these places served as proof of concept for their later New World colonies in the Caribbean and in Brazil. Okay, so we're going to look at all those things in this lecture. All right, three big things, right? Kind of very simple, right? Money, competition with each other and other European nations and other and Muslim traders and Italian traders, and the desire of Christianity, right? Trade brings wealth, right? Spain and Portugal wanted the spices and riches of Asia. The only way they could get that was through Arab and Italian middlemen, right? They had to go through Venice or Algiers or wherever. They don't want to do that anymore, right? Let's sail around Africa, get it ourselves. We'll save money, right? We can make more that way, right? So there's that desire to bypass the Silk Road, basically, right? Direct contact, right? Competition. Spain and Portugal, rivals, right? On the same continent, on the same peninsula, right? Similar, but also rivals with each other, and in competition with each other, and then also competition with the Arab traders, the Italian traders, eventually competition with the English, competition with the Dutch, competition with the French, right? Other European powers, all right? So there's that competition, and then Christianity, right? This is many were really motivated by the desire to save souls and spread Christianity, right? And the Reconquista, right, which is when Spain finally forces the last Muslim kingdom off the Iberian Peninsula. That's 1492. It's the same year Columbus sails, right? And when Spain takes over, they basically force all the Jews and all the Muslims who were living in Spain under this Muslim kingdom to convert or leave, right? So you kind of have Christianity, you have the economic and military competition, and then just a desire for wealth. All right. So the Portuguese kind of lead the way in this, right? Famous Portuguese monarch, Prince Henry the Navigator, all right, who is going to send numerous Portuguese exploring and sailing and trading missions south along the coast of Africa, right? Trying to get around those Muslim middlemen in the Mediterranean, right? The Caravel, important new ship design, which had a lot of cargo space and had stolen Arab sailmaking design, which which allowed them to sail on the much rougher Atlantic Ocean compared to the Mediterranean much more easily. All right. The astrolabe, all right, for calculating latitude, right? The magnetic compass, right? So these are technological things that allowed for much better navigation, right? To allow sailors to know where they are, right? And then the kind of understanding of the Atlantic Ocean's wind patterns, currents, the Gulf Stream, right? How to use these kind of natural occurring patterns to help Portuguese sailors get to Africa, get farther south, get there quicker, get home quicker. All of these things kind of all come together, right? So the Portuguese are going to be able to, from their position on the Atlantic coast, are able to really drive out and especially head towards Africa. Okay. So Spain and Portugal are going to conquer a number of small Atlantic islands: the Azores, the Madeiras, the Canaries, Cape Verde, Sao Tome, which is off the coast of Africa. These small islands, and these kind of beginnings here, right? So the Canary Islands are brought under Spanish rule in 1497, right? And they're going to bring plantation-based sugar agriculture to these places, right? So again, the wealth and the trade, right? The Europeans see the possibility of setting up these luxury goods, these plantations to grow these luxury goods, sugar being the major one. There's a huge demand for sugar in Europe, right? They first enslaved kind of the native population, but then the enslaved population there, the native population of the islands, didn't survive very long under these incredibly brutal conditions, right? And sugar agriculture is very dangerous. It's very hot. You have to burn the fields. You have to melt down the sugar, right? It's very kind of an almost industrial. Right? You're swinging machetes around all the time. It's a tropical climate. Like sugar plantations killed lots of people, right? And as these native populations dropped, the slave trade, which would already been existed, especially between the Muslim world and Africa, right, becomes a potential source of labor for these sugar plantations, right? And as the New World discovered, the Caribbean and Brazil, right? The Caribbean for Spanish, Brazil for the Portuguese, right? They're able to kind of take this practice, this knowledge they gain in running these sugar plantations, building the slave labor system, and then expanding it and scaling it to the Caribbean islands. Okay, and Africa plays a role in this. It's not the dark continent. It's not this unknown place. This is a place that's already very connected, especially to the Islamic world. Right? These kingdoms are known. Muslim traders are crossing the Sahara. Kind of a very famous example of this kind of a man that Europeans would have known, been Mansa Musa, right? So this is 1324. He goes on his pilgrimage from Mali to Mecca, right? And he's so rich, and he throws out gold coins when he's in Egypt that it causes hyperinflation, basically, right? It devalues gold in Egypt for years, right? He was throwing around so much money, right? So you had some wealth, you had power. He made money from salt, he made money from slaves, right? You had a kind of a existing slave trade in Africa that had always existed, right? These kingdoms you'd fight wars, you'd capture slaves, you'd sell the slaves to other people, maybe you keep them yourself. It wasn't the same system as chattel slavery, all right? But it was something that had existed, right? Sub-Saharan Africa, a little different. Mali is in the Sahara. It's kind of smaller towns. There are some empires. There are some stateless societies. You had Jewish people. You had Jewish communities, you had Christian communities, right? Like Ethiopia was a Christian nation for a very long time at this point. Like Islam was spreading to the area, right? So you had like lots of spreading, kind of a very diverse group of people, very diverse forms of government, very diverse areas, right? So, lots going on. It's a tough area to really kind of categorize, right? Um, and then the Portuguese are going to head south and make these first major connections. All right, so Portugal is going to be kind of on the front lines of this and the roots of the slave trade, right? So in 1491, King Nzinga of the Congo was baptized. His name's Jalo first, right? He converted to Catholicism. His son, Alfonso I, right, remained Catholic, converted kind of the elites necessarily to Catholicism, right? But kind of created this kind of connection between Portugal and the Congo, right? One of the princes actually sent to become a bishop, right? So the Congo had, was moving towards Portugal, and created this kind of alliance with Portugal, and Portuguese merchants would marry into the Congolese elite. There was kind of a Portuguese African merchant community, right, trading gold, ivory, things like that. But one of the major things was happening here, right, which is a kind of major point in the African economy was slaves, right? You'd fight a war, you'd capture slaves, you'd sell the slaves, right? As the sugar colonies, these sugar islands, the demand for labor increased as these brutal conditions on the sugar plantations led to. You have the increased demand for enslaved people, right? And these slave traders would take these slaves and bring them to these islands, right? And this is kind of the beginning of this, right? And there's real scholarly debate about this, right? What's the main reason this is happening, right? Is it racism? Is it economics? Is it disregard for humanity, right? And there's competing kind of arguments for this, right? How different from the existing slave trade in Africa is this new one focused on the Europeans? I think fair to say it's pretty different, right? But the sugar, the labor demand of the cash crops that are grown, whether sugar, eventually tobacco, they require significant numbers of people to do very brutal work, right? So, just kind of to zoom out a little bit and kind of give this broader overview of this, right? Like, we're looking at nearly 12 million people taken from Africa and sent to the Americas as slaves, right? Huge number right there until really I think the 1840s, 1820s maybe. The majority of people that had gone from the old world to the new world had been African, right? So you have like real, especially the Caribbean and Brazil, especially, which are the main ending points for most of the slave trade. British North America, talk about the Chesapeake or the American South, ultimately relatively small destination point for this trade. Overwhelming majority are going to Brazil and into the Caribbean. And the plantation agriculture there, the sugar cane agriculture there, is brutal, right? Between tropical diseases, between the hard labor conditions, the heat, the violent treatment, right? Many of these people are going to die, right? And there's also this, as the demand increases, right? Slavery, which had always been part of African society and these African governments and a result of these wars within Africa, as the demand increases, the wars become more frequent for the purpose of capturing the slaves, right? So that as demand was increasing from the Europeans, it unleashed more war and more slavery in Africa than had existed before, right? There is, Europeans, many of whom kind of very immediately realized they were doing the wrong thing and that this was bad and evil, come up with all sorts of justifications, right? Are they not people? Are they just, are we actually saving them? We're going to convert them to Christianity, rescue them from paganism, right? Is this a racist kind of views as Africans as subhuman? Is this just about greed and profit? Frankly, it's everything, right? But these kind of rationalizations the Europeans come up with don't ever really get them to stop anything, right? And you kind of see that they're, the argument, starting almost immediately is that this is bad, and where many Europeans from the outset are saying, well, not many, some Europeans from the outset are saying that this is, we're being hypocritical, or we're being bad, and this is bad treatment of these people. Right? So it's about wealth, it's about competition, it's about Christianity, right? There's motives come, and we have the technology, right? That we have new ships, we have new technology, we have more navigation ability, right? And we also have this economic engine for it, right? Like discovery and like they could sail there, but if there's a reason to sail there, they're not going to make any money from it. It's not really worth going, right? The plantations create the economic case for these, and you'll see, the sugar islands in the Caribbean are long seen as the most valuable of these European colonies in the New World, right? Brazil, Haiti, Barbados, right? Jamaica, right? These are the places that these European emperors really protected, really relied on, right? And then that labor feeding that luxury goods into Europe, that sugar, eventually the tobacco into Europe, is going to rely on eventually African slave labor, indentured servitude, unfree labor, right? Whether it's Native American, indentured servants, or African slaves. All right, for the discussion question for class. Portugal and Spain built their Atlantic systems by using tools and practices, plantation agriculture, forced labor, colonial administration. First test on these Canary Islands, Sao Tome, the Mierdas, Azores, right? What does this dress rehearsal suggest about how empires develop?